Today we're going to get into part 2 of the semester. Part 1 was talking about the nervous system, parts of the brain, parts of the central nervous system, all of that stuff. Part of physiology, all the basic principles we need to understand. Now that we're talking about part 2, we're moving into the neurodevelopmental sequence. How, all of the stuff in part 1 is important, that's dealing with the mature brain, but now we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at how movement develops. And when we start talking about that, we have to have a conversation about the neurodevelopmental sequence. The reason we're going to talk about it is it essentially is the universal progression for human development. Everybody on the planet, no matter where you were born, what language you speak, what your religion is, what color your skin is, everybody goes through this exact same progression with no instructions. There's no instruction manual. It's not like we're born and we, have to hit system update. We hit the system update and 45 minutes later, we've downloaded all the new stuff and we go. It's a several year progression for us to get through that. Overall, this progression has remained relatively unchanged. I say relatively unchanged because there has been one recent addition to this progression that happened right about the same time we started to have these nice fancy floors on the ground and not dirt floors. And that made a little change, little wrinkle in what's going on in how infants progress through this. And even today, you can go to there's some very isolated indigenous populations that if you go and you watch how their babies develop, they don't go through the exact progression we're going to talk about today. They skip a step because they don't have these nice, fancy technological advances of the floors. So we can kind of get a glimpse into how technology and I say technology, we're really talking about the floor, how adding in a floor has made one small change to the progression, but even without that change, prior to floors, it was still a relatively consistent and universal progression. And even with that, it's still a relatively consistent and universal progression. And here's the thing, one of the important things about the neurodevelopmental sequence. We call it a sequence because with the sequence, once the sequence starts, it only has one destination. It only gets to the end. There are no options. You start the sequence and you get to the end of the sequence, or you start the sequence and it stops. And from a movement standpoint, when that sequence stops, that's like what we talked about a little bit a couple weeks ago. That's why every pediatrician, every parent of a newborn on the planet, they have these lists of milestones that they keep an eye out for. And they look at these milestones, not so that they can post about it on social media when their baby does this, that, or whatnot, which they do, but more so because the pediatrician, the healthcare provider, wants to make sure that this sequence is happening and continuing to move forward. Because if it stops, or if we run into any kind of movement issues or movement delays, or if there's any movement that's missed, we're not worried about it from a movement standpoint, we're worried about it from a neurological standpoint. Okay, so wonderful. That all makes kind of perfect sense and everything. But from a rehab standpoint, not a single one of us works with babies. So why is this sequence even important? Because if we go right across the street and we sit in class with the PT department, the PT students, they're going to be talking about this as well. And they have an entry to the neurodevelopmental sequence. They go over it. They talk about some of the same things we're going to talk about over the next week or so. But then they have a pediatric specialty that really dives into this. That's not you guys. So why are we going to dive into this deeper than what they're exposed to at an entry level? Because how often in rehab are we at some level addressing and fixing movement? Let's even go back to, as an athletic trainer, our wheelhouse, an ankle sprain. Somebody sprains their ankle. Do we have to address movement with that? Absolutely. Minimum thing that we're going to have to do is reintroduce them to walking, get them to walk without a limp. And like you've heard me say several times already this semester, gait training is absolutely atrocious. Gait training, the way that we're all taught and the way we're all learned it, is just a random collection of exercises. And we string them together and we hope that they work. Let's rewind a couple weeks. Exercise, least important variable. Exercise does not matter. But yet we string together all these fancy exercises and hope that it works. Hope's not a plan. Hope's not a course of action. Gait training, the way we've formally been taught it, doesn't work because it's not based on anything other than trying to recreate this thing from a movement standpoint that's happening where we shift our weight and we pick our foot up and we dorsiflex and we step and we do all this stuff. That's not how we develop walking. That's not how the gait process develops. And so if we try to do that, like I said, we can try to do it. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But we're healthcare professionals. We're not in the world of hoping things work out. We're going to do something. We need to know I'm going to do this and this is going to be the outcome. Not I'm going to do these drills and 50% of the time it works and 80% of the time it doesn't. Because that's really the reality of it. Because when we take this scattergun, this shotgun approach, we throw crap up on the wall, we always highlight the one or two that we do well with, and we sweep under the rug the ones that we don't. And it's never 50-50. We say it's 50-50, but it's like 50% of the time it works, but like 90% of the time it doesn't. We highlight the one or two and we forget all the others. So when it comes to restoring movement, we can do all of these fancy exercises that aren't important and hope that it works. And that's what the industry is doing right now. Just look at social media. I've joked about it before. Here's the exercise my physical therapist, my pro PT showed me to resolve anterior knee pain. It's not about the exercise. This is the greatest exercise to restore ACLs after this is the greatest exercise to strengthen the ACL if you've torn your ACL. Well, first off, physiologically, you can't strengthen the ACL. Second, this exercise doesn't matter. But yet, we're enamored by the exercise. When we're talking about the exercises, we're having a conversation. It's like a bunch of soccer moms arguing about which jersey their kids are going to wear on Saturday when their kids go out and play soccer. At the end of the day, what color jersey they're arguing about, all that time and the energy they're devoting to this, might be a valid argument, and it's occupying their day, and it's getting everybody all riled up on the group chats and the clickbaits and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, with or without a jersey, it's not going to determine if they win or lose that soccer game. That's the discussion of exercise. Create all kind of drama, get people all fired up, but at the end of the day, doesn't mean a thing. So that's why we have to look back from a movement standpoint. What can we actually follow? What can we actually anchor our approach to that can give us a definite end point that we know if we do this, we will get to this point. And that's where the neural developmental sequence comes in, because this is how we originally acquire movement. We all start with the same basic parts. We all start with the same basic software. None of us have an instruction manual. And I would guarantee that within a 3-year window, we all went through the exact same progression and ended up being able to be up on 2 feet and walk normally. All without any instructions. The nice part about that is for the duration of our lifespan, that becomes a hardwired blueprint. My TV at home, for some reason, when we bought this model of Samsung, this version of the Samsung TV that we got, you hook it up to the internet, it doesn't maintain an internet connection. You turn it on, you hook it up to the internet, you can watch everything you want to. As soon as you turn it off, it disconnects the internet. And you have to go through that whole process of reacquiring the internet, finding the internet, put in the password. It's a long, boring process. And we've had that TV for 4 years now. I spent 2 years every time we would turn it on, go to YouTube TV. Here's my login name, here's my password, log in. And that was to the internet, not to YouTube TV. I had to log into the internet. And I would do that every time, like, it's so hard to watch TV because I can't work my thumb the way I work a keyboard, and it takes me forever. Finally, after 2 years, I didn't say I was the quickest, But I did find a solution. I got to look and I'm like, I can't be the only one that's having this problem. With this TV, there's a hardwired reset. That yes, this TV, every time you turn it off, it loses it breaks that internet connection. But there's a hardwired reset that if you hold the power button on while the TV is off, it'll go through a startup process and reacquire that internet connection. It's a hardwired process so that you can do this every time. So now instead of having to go through and internet, this is a network I want, just login name, password, forgot to capitalize. Instead of having to go through that, I just hold the power button down. It takes 90 seconds from the time I decide I want to turn the TV on to the time the TV's on. Not a 5-minute process. For 2 years, I didn't know there was that hardwired process in there. Athletic trainers, we can do all of this stuff and hope that it works, and we get very frustrated, and it just takes forever. We're not efficient. But there's this hardwired button that we can hold down that is meant to bypass all of this, and it will end up with us getting the movement that we want. We just have nowhere to look. How many of you guys have run into situations where you have to restore knee extension? Pretty much every post-op knee surgery, right? I'm all about the simple things. When we're trying to restore knee extension, how do you have the person on the table? You have them laying on their back or sitting up, and we do our things to work on knee extension? Yeah? You're going against a null developmental sequence. When we try to restore hip flexion, do we have them laying on their belly or do we have them laying on their back? So somebody, post-op hip pain patient, somebody only has 90 degrees of hip flexion. We're trying to get it all the way up to 130 degrees plus. Just you have them laying on their back or you have them laying on their belly? So we're tapping into the right place there. What's the difference between going after knee extension and going after hip flexion? What are the two differences between those? Remember, the very basic differences. What are the two differences between those two bullet points? One's a knee, one's a hip, right? Does it really matter what joint we're talking about, if it's flexion or extension? Not really. What's the other one? Flexion and extension. Flexion, we acquire flexion very specifically in very specific postures. We acquire extension very specifically in very specific postures. If we try to acquire extension in a flexion-based posture, we can. But that's me having to go through and manually do a lot more work than I really need to do because I'm going against what the process is. Same thing when we're going after extension in the wrong posture. I've already talked about gait training. How many times we try to teach a deadlift or a squat? Better yet, how many times we watch somebody squat and go, oh, that's horrible? Yeah. Well, that's the situation where we ultimately should need to be teaching somebody how to squat or how to deadlift. There's a very specific progression that we start out with that ends up in a squat that starts on the ground. Very similar to the one that we start when we go through a deadlift, where we progress through that to where when I get somebody and we get to the point where we're doing deadlifts from a rehab standpoint, I don't have to coach the deadlift because by the time I get them into the deadlift, they're where I want them to be. We've addressed all the other things in the lower postures. Instead of just standing people up and trying to coach them. Go for it. You can try and coach them. There's a lot of great coaches on the planet that aren't able to coach people into a deadlift when they have some problems going on. And there's a lot of people that aren't great coaches that don't even have a shot at it. And that's where most healthcare professionals fall into play. And on top of it, if we have somebody that is lacking knee extension or lacking knee flexion, and then we're going to try and coach them into a deadlift, you literally have no chance. You're not going to be able to do it. The odds are stacked against you, and you're between a rock and a hard place. You can try, and you can exert a lot of effort, but at the end of the day, you did a lot of effort. High five for your effort. No, it's success or failure. I don't care what level of effort you brought to the table. If what you worked really hard and we got really close to a deadlift, wonderful. Can they deadlift? No. Then I don't care how much effort you put in because what you did wasn't good. Versus, I didn't do anything. Here's these 3 postures. Do this, do this, do this, do this. I put in about half a second of thought. I didn't do hardly any work, and we progressed, and they got a great deadlift. Are you going to now applaud me because my lack of effort that actually achieved it? Because I followed a progression? From a movement standpoint, it's success or failure. That's it. We either restore knee extension or we don't. We either restore knee flexion or we don't. We either get rid of a limb or we don't. We know we have immediate feedback with our rehab patients whether or not what we're doing is being successful. And that is, did we address and fix the thing that we're trying to address and fix? And if we did, wonderful. What we're doing is working. But if we're trying to fix knee extension and we just spent 45 minutes working on knee extension and we didn't fix knee extension, and this is the 3rd day in a row we've done this, I don't care what you did. You can tell me how hard you worked and all your great intents, wonderful, but it's a pass-fail game. You met it or you didn't. It's one of the reasons why I love basketball. I put a shot up, and I know right away whether what I did was successful or not. You either make it or you miss it. You get immediate feedback. I mean, you never heard Michael Jordan. You don't hear right now about any basketball player that puts up a shot and they miss it. Oh, he really wanted to make that shot. He tried so hard, and we should just give him the point. No, we don't. You get the points if you make the basket. Intent and effort are assumed. And at the end of the day, intent and effort don't really matter because there's a lot of people out there, go to a junior high basketball game. You'll see people that just throw crap up and it goes in. Their intent and their effort doesn't really matter. And then you have the kids at practice and their shot goes in. We can't award intent and effort. It's success or failure. From a movement standpoint, we either teach a deadlift or we don't. We either improve gait training or we don't. We either teach somebody to run or we don't. And again, this sequence, the neurodevelopmental sequence, gives us a blueprint to where we know it. You can read a map, a lot like GPS. You know exactly where you are, and you know where you want to be. Here's the progression to get there. And you just have to follow the progression. If you don't, good luck. Like I said, the typical approach, the traditional way in which we've always done this is we throw stuff up on the wall. We hope that it sticks. And when it sticks, we highlight those 1 or 2 things that stick, those 1 or 2 cases are successful, but then we try to forget all those failures that we sweep underneath the rug. I mean, when was the last time we talked about that post-op ACL patient that it only took us 24 months, but we got them back to the rehab. We did a great job. What we talk about is that post-op ACL patient, they were back playing football, they were back on the field at 6 months, not 24 months. We highlight our successes. We highlight the ones that we do great with, not the ones that we don't. Why this is important. You've seen this before, almost. The last time you saw this, it said movement in the brain change together. When we're talking about the neurodevelopmental sequence, we have to change it a little bit. Movement in the brain develop together. Again, that goes back to why those movement milestones are so important from a pediatrician standpoint. Pediatricians could care less whether or not your baby's crawling. Most parents, listen, when you have a kid, my baby's crawling, that's awesome. It's awesome for all about 5 minutes. At the 6th minute, you're like, oh, this sucks. Why? That baby that can't crawl, set them here. I can walk over here. I can spend 20 minutes over here doing something. I'm going to come back. They can't crawl. They're not very far away from where I left them. Pretty much know where they're going to be. But as soon as they acquire that freedom of movement, that locomotion skill of crawling, set them down and they're off. And now instead of me coming over here and being able to do something, now I'm starting to do something. Get back here. And then you buy the baby cage as a leash or whatever, and you keep them there. Because now they've gotten to the point that their nervous system has developed, their movement has developed, that now they can actually go and do things. That's what the pediatrician is concerned about, because that ability to go do things reflects what's going on within the nervous system. I see something that draws my attention. I want to go investigate it. That's what we want to know has happened, not the fact that they can crawl. Crawling is the external reflection of all those internal processes that have to take place. Those are the things that we're worried about if we don't see the crawl, not the fact that they can't crawl, those internal processes. And why we do that is because movement in the brain develop together. As we see movement improve, as we see movement become more robust, the same thing's happening with the nervous system. This is a neurodevelopmental sequence, 6 postures. There's some variation. I say variations. There's some variations within each posture, but they all break down into these 6 postures. Supine, prone, quadruped, sitting, kneeling, vertical stance. Usually when I'm talking about the neurodevelopmental sequence, I'll say supine, prone, quadruped, sitting, kneeling, vertical stance. I'm talking about the neurodevelopmental continuum. I call them 2 other different things, supine, prone, quadruped, stuff like that, because there's a little bit of variation off of those. These are the 6 postures. These are the 6 postural progression. In general, if we think about this postural progression, we start, if we compare supine to vertical stance, supine, there's 0 mobility, 0 freedom of movement. They can't really go anywhere. Vertical stance, they have complete freedom of movement. So we progress in freedom of movement. Supine, they have a very large base of support. Their entire body's contacting the ground. In vertical stance, bottom of the feet. So automatically, if we think about that, we're getting sensory, we have to get sensory input from the entire floor, the entire thing we're laying on, in order to be able to appropriately do the things we want to do. And we progress to being able to just get sensory input through the bottom of the feet and get all the information that we need. So we see a progression there that we talked about in part 1. Supine, prone, all of the stability is coming from the ground. The earth is providing 100% of the stability. In vertical stance, we have to generate all of the stability. So we go from an external source of stability to an internal source of stability. If you look at the level of where the eyes are, we assume the ground is here. We look at where the level of the eyes are. With each posture, that goes a little bit higher. We have a higher perspective. Why is that important? Let me ask you this. What color was the car that just pulled in the driveway? If you guys were looking out the window, can you even see the color? You can't even see the car that's pulling in. I can't. Why can I see it and you guys can't? I have a higher perspective. I can see more visual input, more sensory input, more things to grab my attention and make me want to go over there and not stay here. So we get a higher level of perspective, which allows us to get more sensory input, more information about the world around us. As we leave the ground and work our way up, our world expands because we can see more, we can hear more. So basically, this progression is a progression of complexity. Everything's nice and simple when we're in supine and prone. As we stand up, we have a lot more information, a lot more things we're having to process. It requires a lot more complexity within our nervous system. Our nervous system has to be a lot more robust to be able to handle all of that information, so that we can put it together and make effective and create effective solutions for whatever's going on around us. All right, let's talk about sensory information real quick. When the infant's born, we have all of our 5 senses: vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. We have the ability to take in sensory information from each one of those. However, they're not all at the level of when we're an adult. when we're mature. In fact, none of them really are. At birth, from a vision standpoint, it's very limited. They can see things about 8 to 10 inches away. Beyond that, it's just shades of different colors. Babies, infants have really good peripheral vision, but they don't have really good central vision. So they can see things on their periphery to about 8 to 10 inches. Beyond that, everything's blurry, but they can't really see that thing that's right in front of them. There. Now, here's the important thing. From a visual standpoint, their eyes are fully developed. Now, what's different about the eyes is the size of the eyes and the shape of the eyes, because we have to think about that head's been all smushed up inside the womb for quite a while. And so once it's out in the world, we see a reshaping of the head, reshaping of the eye sockets. The eyes change their shape just a little bit, which allows some of the focus to come into play. So the eye reshapes itself a little bit after birth, but the structure of the eye is there. The optic nerve is there. It's connected to the brain. It's connected to the visual area of the brain, the integration area of the brain. But the information that is passing along, we're still working some of the connections out. From a hearing standpoint, our ear, the inner ear, all that's fully developed. We're getting all that sensory information. We don't have any context though. We don't know what any of that stuff is. So it's a lot of information, but we can't make any sense of it. About the only sound infants make, the only sound infants respond to are very loud sounds, because it's a very loud sound. It surprises them, it scares them. Then it turns into they start recognizing mom's voice, they start recognizing dad's voice. They recognize the pitch and the tone of the voice, but they don't understand the words. It takes a while for that to happen. Not because they don't have the parts, but because the connections within the nervous system aren't there. They start to recognize the tone, they start to recognize the inflection, they start to recognize the sounds, and then as that starts to happen, they start to put the words together, they can understand what's going on, but then they can't say anything, they can just understand what's being said. They learn to hear before we learn to speak. That takes a while. Smell's fully developed, but again, just like hearing, we don't have any context. We smell all this stuff, but we don't know what it is. We have no way to know what it is, but the hardware is there. Same thing with taste. Taste buds don't fully develop until a little while after we're born, but otherwise, everything that we need to taste is there. We just don't have any reference points. Don't understand what these tastes are. Infants typically, though, they do tend to like more sweet flavors than anything else. Part of that goes back to the development of the taste buds as well. From a touch standpoint, all of our sensory, all of our cutaneous nerves, everything is there. But once again, we just don't have any context. In supine and in prone, we're getting a ton of sensory input. Think about when you're laying on your back. You have sensory input from back here. If I'm laying on my back, I'm getting sensory input about the object I'm laying on, from the back of my legs all the way up to the back of my head. We're getting a lot of sensory input. We don't know what it means, and again, we don't have context. So we have all the hardware, except for with the eyes. They need to reshape themselves a little bit. Taste buds need to fully develop, but otherwise, we have all the hardware for these systems that we need. What we're lacking is the integration. We don't have a point of reference. We don't have any context. It's also one of the reasons why the recommendation with kids as they're growing up is to expose them to a lot of different kinds and flavors of food, just to develop a taste for something other than chicken nuggets. Went to school with somebody, I was in high school, all she chose to eat was chicken nuggets and mac and cheese. What do you think she ate a lot when she was growing up? Chicken nuggets and mac and cheese. I love me some chicken nuggets and mac and cheese, but I'm not going to eat chicken nuggets and mac and cheese every single day. So that's one of the reasons why there's that recommendation when kids are developing and creating this point of reference, creating this context, is to expose them to all these different flavors
so that they don't just get locked into these one or two things that ends up being the only thing that they like. So we're trying to expose them to as much sensory information as we can so that later on they're not just stuck eating the one or two things. Our first posture is supine. Systemic flexion. Why are we born in systemic flexion? What was that?
That's all we got space for.
All we got, itty bitty living space. Yep. We're compressed into this little bitty tiny space. And so well, I mean, do you guys all have to go through tornado drills as a kid? When you went through the tornado drills, was it okay, everybody lay down on the ground and sprawl out? No, we wanted to be as small as we could be. You flexed into as small of a ball as you could get. Takes up less space that way. So we're born in systemic flexion because we spent 9 months in a very small space. Our spine's flexed, hips, knees, ankles are fully dorsiflexed, our toes are flexed down. Shoulders. Now, when I say shoulder flexion, they're not flexed overhead. Shoulders are flexed in front of midline, and the scapulas are protracted to take up a lot less space. Elbows are flexed, wrists are flexed, and the fingers are flexed. We're right here. How do we unflex? Obviously, we go through the progression, but what causes us to unflex? We're going to lay that maybe on the table. What's going to cause it to unflex?
Yeah.
Eventually, that's what drives even more of it. But initially, we're not going to have that. Gravity is the only thing that's exerting force on that infant. And so what ends up happening as we progress through the neurodevelopmental sequence, it's the one constant force that baby is exposed to is gravity. Gravity influences the progression of the neurodevelopmental sequence. We learn to extend because of how gravity is interacting with the body. At this point, my laser pointer still doesn't work on the TV. Hasn't changed, thought I'd check it. At this point, the only thing we have, because none of our nervous system is integrated with anything. We have no point of reference, we have no context, we don't understand anything. Our survival is completely driven by our reflexes, primitive reflexes. You guys remember hearing about those? Again, we're often taught, or not often, we hear about those as we're learning, as we're going through our initial formal education, but we're taught about those in regards to what happens if we see them later in life as a problem. Great example. How many of us learned the Babinski reflex? We learned the Babinski reflex to test for an upper motor neuron lesion, right? The Babinski reflex is a primitive reflex. That's why if we see it present itself later in life, we know we have a very high level problem. But we're taught about that through the lens of assessing it in an adult. If we have this, it's a problem. Or if this is absent, it's a problem. What we don't gather and what we're not taught is these early reflexes are what allows, within our lizard brain, or what allows survival to happen. Because we have no higher level thought. When we're born, our survival is completely driven by brainstem, midbrain, lower brain areas. Our cortex is there, but nothing's plugged in. You know, all those parts that we talked about in the cortex, the prefrontal lobe, the motor cortex, the visual cortex, the integration areas of each one of those areas, they're all there, but none of the wires are plugged in. So we can't access any of that. So we have to rely on the lower level of the brain where these reflexes live in order for us to survive. As we develop, as we start plugging those things in, as we start getting sensory input from the world around us, as we start to get context, as we start to put all of this stuff together and we start plugging in those different areas, then these reflexes go away. But initially, we have to have these reflexes to survive. This is just a quick list of the reflexes, and you'll notice most of them, last one we run into, the Babinski, is at 12 months. Everything else disappears. Why do they disappear? How do they disappear? When they disappear, it's because a higher level process has taken over that function, that task. That reflex isn't needed anymore. It now goes away. Unless we run into issues later on in life. And sometimes we can see these present themselves. Probably the most familiar we see is the Babinski from an assessment standpoint. The Moro reflex. This one, is that the first one on that list? I skipped two, sorry. The rooting reflex with an infant, if you stroke the side of their cheek, they'll actually turn their head. And they're turning their head because they're looking for food. The sucking reflex, you put anything in their mouth and it's going to start the process of sucking, just because that's how they get milk. So both of those start to go away 3 to 5, around the 3-month mark, around the 5-month mark. Both of those are critical for survival because it's what drives feeding. We're not able to get adequate calories in, that's going to cause problems. So this is what drives feeding. Not them being hungry, not anything along those lines, but this is what allows them to survive. The Moro reflex, with this one, there's a sudden extension of the neck. We see the arms and the hands splay out. They're just spreading things out, palms out, fingers open up. Doesn't involve thumb. Why do you think that happens? Let me ask you this. Does the infant have the ability to consciously control and generate muscle tension? No. So if there's extension of the neck, quick extension of the neck, when might there be quick extension of the neck? Drop or fall. So quick extension of the neck, drop or fall, bring a little bit of muscle tension. We get that reflexive level of tension where we systemically flex a little, we get a little bit of flexion, we splay the arms, we open everything up. This increases. Now, if from a fall prevention standpoint, when you fall, the more of you that's in contact with the ground, the greater those forces are dissipated. So we run into the same thing here. We open the arms out, we get a little bit of muscle tension. It's a protective strategy so that things just don't go flailing around if there is a drop or if there is a fall. Because there's no conscious ability to contract and control those things. Again, just a reflexive to prevent damage to the infant. There's the asymmetric tonic neck reflex. This one, rotate the head to one side, that arm's going to extend out. I don't have any idea why. This is probably one of the ones that leads to the most pictures. The palmar grasp reflex. Little Timmy grabbed my finger, he knows I'm here. No, they grab anything that you put in their hand and they hold on to it. Here's a picture. I don't know that we could recreate this picture today. We might have some issues with that. But basically, the fingers close around an object. It's a grasping technique. Anything in the hand, it's going to grasp onto. You take this one far enough back. Some people say that we get this because of how closely we're related to the different ape species and how the baby has to cling on to the mother and put anything in their hand and it's just going to fall. We see it now as just a nice photo opportunity because the baby's grabbing the hand. We see the same thing in the foot, plantar graft reflex. You press in the middle of the bottom of the foot, and all the toes are going to fall down. The Babinski reflex, stroke the bottom of the foot, and we see the toe split. Big toe extension, second, third, fourth, fifth toe, the AD drop. Stepping reflex, this one's kind of neat. You hold the baby vertical, have their foot come in contact with the ground, and they'll actually have a reflective stepping process, a reflective stepping action that takes place. They have zero ability to walk, but as soon as that foot hits the ground, they start this stepping process. It actually goes away before gait happens. Again, I don't know why this happens, but we see these reflexes. So again, why we mention those reflexes when we're talking supine, we have no ability, we have the ability to do nothing other than lay there. Nervous system isn't developed, physically not developed, interacting with the world around us, gathering sensory input. So something has to ensure or give us a little bit of chance for survival. And that's where these reflexes come into play. And again, we talked about reflexive in the last section a little bit. I think it's important here to highlight when we talk about these reflexes, we see these reflexes happening because the cortex isn't fully developed. We have to have the ability to perform some very basic survival related tasks in the presence of a nervous system where the cortex isn't there, isn't capable of conscious thought, isn't capable of conscious action. All of these reflexes come from the lower levels of the brain. When we're talking movement, when we're talking mature movement, we're talking cortex level integration. We're not talking brainstem level. So when we talk about reflexive movement, we're talking about movement at the wrong level of the brain. Yes, reflexes are important. We learn to assess reflexes, the deep tendon reflexes. We learn to test all of those. Those are all spinal reflexes. But from a stability standpoint, I'm standing here, I take a step, my ability to turn things on and turn things off at the right time in the right sequence so that I actually take a step and don't fall over. There's nothing reflexive about that. That's all conscious. It's all happening very, very quickly. We do run into a reflex when we have somebody that has swelling in the knee. We've talked about this a couple times. Somebody has a knee injury, somebody's had knee surgery and their knee swells up. There is a spinal inhibitory reflex that shuts off the quads. We get too much swelling there. It's a spinal inhibitory reflex. It stops all action potential. Well, it doesn't stop the action potential to the quads, but you cannot contract your quads. You can tell them to squeeze. You can do all the biofeedback stuff you want, but if you don't address the swelling, you can't outcoach a spinal inhibitory reflex. Again, that's happening, and that's one of the reasons why it's so frustrating when you're dealing with these patients, because you talk to them, I'm thinking about contracting my quad, I'm telling my quad to contract, but it's not doing anything. Because we're having these high-level conscious thoughts, but the inhibitory reflex is happening all the way down here. I'm having these thoughts to contract it, but that signal's never getting up to the brain. It's never getting down to the quad because the inhibitory reflex is this reflex loop that's happening in the lumbar plexus. And that's why it's so frustrating because I'm thinking that I need to contract. I'm contracting as hard as I can, but nothing is happening because we have that inhibitory reflex. Movement doesn't happen at a reflexive level. When we talk about postures, when we talk about these things that we repeatedly do, we do have our central pattern generators that we develop these central pattern generators that are kind of like us being on autopilot, but again, not at a reflexive level. We're a little bit higher than that. So reflexes allow survival to happen. Reflexes cause problems, but there's nothing reflexive about movement. Movement happens at a higher level within the nervous system. All right, prone. Prone is where we develop extension. Cervical extension, hip extension, knee extension, ankle extension. I say ankle extension from dorsiflexion to neutral into plantar flexion. Shoulder extension, elbow extension. Prone is a posture of extension. Supine is a posture of systemic flexion. Prone is a posture of systemic extension or extension flexion. With prone, we actually see the superficial front line. We'll talk about this when we talk about the fascial lines in the last part. We'll spend more time on this. But just real quick, prone is where we see our superficial front line, everything on the front side of the body elongate. We actually see the superficial back line, everything on the back side of the body start to actually generate some tension, create some tension. Notice here, if I said, I want you guys to all lay down on your belly, are you going to lay like this? No. Why does the baby lay like that? When you first put the baby in prone on their belly, why do they lay with their hips tucked underneath them? What was that?
Gravity, that is.
Yes, their tissues just haven't been exposed to gravity long enough yet to actually open things up. That's their natural resting position. Because remember, they've been stuck here. And so when we first put them in prone on their belly, they're going to be stuck in this position, only inverted. And so that's one of the reasons why there is the real push for tummy time, so that we put the babies in prone, so that they get exposed to gravity, so that we can extend things out, so that we can develop that, so that we can expose their system to gravity from a completely different orientation to where now their tissues have to respond. In both supine and prone, it's all about manipulating the body so that their tissues have to respond to the orientation of gravity. Gravity is always pointing towards the ground. We can't change where we have gravity pointing. It'd be kind of a neat tool if we could. But what we have to do is move our body's orientation to gravity so that the tissues can adapt. And when we go into prone, when we expose those tissues to gravity in prone, it allows all of these other extensions to take place. It allows us to spread out. It allows our spinal curves to start to develop. It allows us to get out of systemic flexion because we're exposing the body to these postures. So now, with just those two little tidbits of information about supine and prone, if you're trying to create knee extension and you're only doing it out of supine, do you think you're going to be completely successful at generating knee extension? No. Now, there are times where practically what we're trying to do to work on knee extension, we have to have them in supine. So if I'm coming in and I need to do joint lobes. Can I do joint lobes with them laying on their belly? I can, but it's very hard. And you have to have a lot of experience doing joint lobes with somebody in supine before you can flip them over into prone and get the same kind of outcome. So if I need to do joint lobes, I'm going to create knee extension. I'm going to do those joint lobes out of a supine position, out of a sitting position. But then I want to spend some time in prone to expose them to that, to where we're having to get knee extension. One of the most overused exercises. It has its place. I'm not saying that this is a horrible exercise that has no purpose. What I said was one of the most overused exercises. This is an exercise that has its place, has its purpose, but we can make it better, and that's the quad set. We sit somebody on the ground. We sit somebody on the ground, and we tell them to extend their quad. Right? That's how we have them do it. which way is gravity pushing us? That way. So gravity is kind of already assisting us to get our knee down to the ground, and we're not able to do it. You lay somebody down on their belly, though, if they're up on their toes, now their knees naturally flex because gravity is pushing them into a flexed position. You're now having to actually push back against gravity. You actually have the opportunity to have a little bit of movement, to actually drive into extension versus starting here and having to go the same direction that gravity's going. So it's a different sensory environment because of the orientation of gravity. And the body learns to extend the knee fully when we're in prone. So I'm not saying if we're going after knee extension, we're automatically laying the person on their belly and everything we're doing is in prone. Not saying that. There are some things that we have to do out of supine to address knee extensions, but we do need to expose them to prone because of the influence of gravity and how that can change what they're experiencing. If we're going after extension anywhere, we need to spend some time in prone. If you're laying down on the ground, if you're laying in supine and we want to work on shoulder extension, what's the big problem? If you're laying on the table and we want to work on shoulder extension, what's the big problem? You can't go back because you're laying on the table. You can get about that much shoulder extension. That's not shoulder extension, that's maybe a little bit past neutral. So if I'm wanting to get shoulder extension, I can't have anything blocking me. So I can lay on my belly, and that opens up a lot. Okay, Brandon, but how often do we work on shoulder extension? Good point. How many times do we try to fix this? Well, if I'm laying on my back, so if I'm laying on my back, and I'm trying to retract my scapula, what's the biggest block to that? The table, because I have my two scapula, and I'm trying to retract them, and they're going to bump into that table. I can't get it. Versus laying somebody in prone on their belly, now I can actually retract that, go into scapular extension, and then go into shoulder extension. So very simple things in our world that we often run into, that we put them in a posture that makes it hard for us to do the thing that we're trying to do. And again, this is a great example to show the importance of the exercise. If we're working on scapular retraction, wonderful exercise. But if I'm doing it with my back on the table, we just took this exercise as appropriate, and how we executed the exercise, we made it ineffective. All we need to do is lay them on their belly to where they're not running into the table. And that's where extension develops. So we can leverage these hardwired principles to do the thing we're trying to do and get a little bit better results with. This is also in prone where we have our first purposeful expression of strength. What do you guys think our first purposeful expression of strength is? Pushing. Pushing down into the ground to get our shoulders, to get our head up off of the ground. Pushing through the upper extremity into the ground. Our first resistance is gravity. So obviously, if we're involved, not saying it was ever me, obviously if we're involved in an argument on social media about which kind of resistance training is the best, it's body weight, because that's the actual original resistance exercise. So prone gives us access to our first purposeful expression of strength, which is pushing our hands into the ground, pushing our upper extremity into the ground to get our shoulders away. Now, what drives that though? What drives and motivates us to push down into the ground? What are we trying to do with this? What was that? Move which direction? Up. And what does going up give us? A little bit higher perspective. It starts to expand our world. Because if you guys all lay your head down on the table, you can literally see the stuff that's right on in front of you. You roll your head to the side, you can see a little bit more. You roll your head to the other side, you can see a little bit more. But you can't really see a whole lot. The first, and notice here, it's purposeful. The purpose is to get more sensory input, to expand our world, to get a little bit higher perspective, to make our position a little bit better. We can't stand up all the way, but what we can do is lift our head a little bit higher. And by doing that, we get more sensory input. As we do that, this becomes a foundation, this strengthening, pushing down into the ground, this becomes a foundation of our head, our neck, and our jaw musculature. Why is that important later in life? Even more important than head control. If this doesn't develop, this is a really boring class. It involves a sensory. Here, let me give you an example. If my head, neck, and jaw musculature doesn't fully develop, this is what this class sounds like. You guys hear anything? Why not? Because I stopped talking. Because if head, neck, and jaw musculature don't develop appropriately, it's going to affect our ability to make noise, which later turns into our vocal control. So pushing down into the ground, yes, it's our foundation of upper body strength, which from a performance standpoint opens the door to a lot of things, but it also sets the foundation of language, our ability to vocalize language and communicate. So prone is critical from a performance standpoint, and it's also critical from a communication standpoint, because we get a lot of things out of this one posture. And then the last part that ties into the foundation of the head, neck, and jaw musculature is when we're on our belly and we're having to push down into the ground, we're also pushing our belly into the ground, which is creating a unique pressure on our diaphragm, which again is tying it back into language. So pushing our hands into the ground, pushing our belly into the ground, everything from our neck down to our diaphragm is now having to respond and react to different sensory input, which creates a foundation for language. Had a patient when I was at Health Tracks. He had all kinds of developmental delays. They came to us because he was 8 or 9 at the time, maybe 10. He was on a soccer team at the Y, never got to play, really, watching him run is why his parents brought him in. He had trouble running, he tripped all the time, he was always 3 or 4 steps behind, he couldn't react, he just couldn't do a lot of things the other kids were doing. And he had a lot, talking to mom, there were a lot of developmental delays. When he was a baby, he had eczema really bad. And so his skin would break out and he would try to scratch his skin. And when I say when he was a baby, we're talking the 4 to 6 month age range. And so they put gloves on him and he still would do it and it would still break the skin, break the lesions open. And so finally his pediatrician was like, we got to get these lesions to calm down. So let's strap him to this board. So they had this thing that they strapped the baby to. He could bring his arms to here, but he couldn't reach over here. He couldn't reach over here. So he couldn't actually get his hand to anywhere to touch himself on the other side. Happened to also be during that time where he should have started to crawl. He didn't start to crawl. And so it was like this for a while. Eczema went away. They took him off of that little contraption. He never crawled. Never ever established the ability to crawl. So got up into his feet, spent some time in supine, spent some time in prone, never any time in quadruped or crawling, went straight to sitting, did a lot of scooting, eventually started to walk, all delayed. And so mom brings him in, brought him in because of what they observed on the soccer field. But as I'm talking to mom and getting this history, he's also really struggling in school. You can't read his handwriting. When he gets excited and starts talking, you couldn't understand him. Mom and dad could understand him, but nobody else could understand him. Had a lot of trouble, with speaking and everything. Or not a lot of trouble, but again, when he got excited, it just got to where you couldn't understand it. Which obviously all of that led to some issues in school. And so I have no clue what we're going to do with this kid, because you can't, all the very basic simple things that you expect a kid to be able to do, he couldn't do any of that stuff. So all of our basic things he couldn't do. That's one of the, you guys remember the Brandon dance we did last week and how easily we were able to do that? That was a month-long progression just to get him to go to here and be able to do anything. Like, just so reach your hands up, you cross over and you grab like this, right? That's not that hard. This is what it was like. Okay, reach your arms out, take your right hand, reach it over the left, and then grab your palms. And he got to right here. And like, he literally was like, I'm doing it. I'm like, no, you're not. He's like, I'm doing exactly what you asked. I'm like, you're not even in the ballpark of doing what I asked. Why? Because for a very critical time period, he couldn't cross midline. If he's strapped to a board, do you think he was able to roll over very well? Missed all of that. Like, you would get in here and things would get complicated. You got in here and like, when he got excited, you had a hard time understanding what he was saying. I could recreate that by doing this. As soon as you crossed his arms over midline, he didn't have to be excited, you couldn't understand what he was saying. He could be talking to you and you crossed his arms over, you were understanding him, you couldn't understand. It was a great party trick. Mom and dad were amazed when I showed them. I was like, hey, have you guys noticed this before? Like, no, we've never noticed it, because he never reaches across his body. Because it was like static was increasing. As soon as his hands crossed midline, everything went crazy, because he was never exposed to that during a critical period. So guess what our rehab was? A lot of just crossing midline. And eventually it was, we could get him to cross midline and he could have a conversation with me. And then it turned into, let's get it across midline and let's turn your thumbs over. And then all of a sudden we recreated everything again. It's like that, those steps forward that we made, all of a sudden right back to zero. And so then it turned into just a lot of exposure to this. And then we finally got him to here, and then once we got him here, he was just stuck. Like, he couldn't get out of this. It was one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. Couldn't get out of this, couldn't do anything from this. We had to work him through it. Eventually, and again, he came to us because mom and dad wanted him to run better. So we finally go through this very basic progression, very basic things with him. We got him to where his running actually kind of looked like some running stuff. We spent time crawling, we spent time scooting, we did a lot of rolling on the ground. We never did any running stuff with us, but his running was improving. And so he was with us for probably about the 6 to 9 month mark. Mom and dad came back, like, hey, you went to soccer tryouts, you went to soccer practice. He didn't score any goals, he didn't really do anything, but he was able to run with the group. He actually wasn't the kid that was standing out, because like the whole group, this was young kids soccer, so it was like the whole amoeba of the ball and the group of people went this way, and then there was a straggler that was kind of behind him keeping up. That was always him. And then the amoeba would go this way, and then there was him. They were like, he wasn't that kid that didn't look like he knew what he was doing. He didn't do anything, but he was at least running with the rest of the kids. He wasn't falling down. Fell down a couple times because he got hit, but it wasn't just, he didn't trip by himself anymore. He was able to do all of this stuff, and he was talking to the kids. And what surprised me the most was they're like, here, look at what he wrote in school today. And his handwriting, it looked like two completely different people. And again, we didn't do anything fancy. I ended up working with this kid for another 2 years after this, and we finally were able to transition into and actually do things that looked like lifting related stuff and movement related things. But we started with this, and it went back to, he missed that critical period where he couldn't cross midlines. And when that doesn't happen, those connections don't integrate the way that they're supposed to. And again, that's where the movement and the nervous systems develop together. And this is where one of the problems of being human comes into play. These connections didn't happen. He still continued. When I said that there is a new addition to the developmental sequence, it's quadruped. Before floors, quadruped didn't exist. We went from supine to prone to sitting, a propped sitting, and we scooted on our butts. That was how we got from point A to point B. Quadruped didn't exist. So he was able to go through the sequence without having quadruped because he was able to go straight into sitting and scoot it around on his butt. So the sequence was able to continue because what he experienced was the loophole that we have the one place we have a workaround. Babies either have to crawl with quadruped or they have to scoot in sitting. They have to do one of the two. He accessed it and progressed through sitting. But what happened was all the connections that could have been developed, all the cross-lateralization, all of the things that develop in quadruped, he didn't have access to. He found a workaround, he adapted to it, and what we saw was a movement issue that developed later on in life. What we ended up doing was we went back and we did a lot of things out of quadruped, a lot of things that quadruped provides, and gave him a lot of exposure there and progressed from there. Quadruped, it's our first exposure of the spine where the spine's not on the ground. Prone and supine up to this point, the ground has provided 100% of our stabilization. Here, we have to actually provide some stability. We have to be able to generate enough force in the shoulder girdle, enough force in the pelvic girdle and in the hips to elevate our trunk up off the ground, which builds off of that pushing down. Now, instead of just pushing down and getting our shoulders and head off the ground, now we're pushing down, getting our shoulders and head and our hips off the ground. We then also have to have enough muscular endurance to be able to spend enough time there to do the things that we're wanting to do. So we get force production and we get endurance. We get big toe extension here because the toes are tucked underneath. We also have our first exposure of loaded dorsiflexion and loaded wrist extension. Why is that important? How many times do we try to restore dorsiflexion? A lot. Told you guys a story about how long I would spend on an angle board daily. Our first exposure to loaded dorsiflexion isn't in standing, it's in quadruped with the knee flexed. So, again, I'm not saying that 100% of the time we have an ankle sprain patient, we only have to do things down in quadruped, and that's the only way we work on getting ankle dorsiflexion back, and that we need to avoid all the stuff that we do in standing. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is if you have a dorsiflexion issue and you haven't spent any time in quadruped, you're not getting all the dorsiflexion back. You need to spend a little bit of time there because of how it integrates the big toe, how it integrates the knee, how it leads to the acquisition of dorsiflexion. We get here when we have enough force production to get off the ground, when we have enough endurance to be able to spend some time there. So this is also one of those things that starts to highlight the importance of strength. Because if we don't have enough strength, we don't get off the ground. If you're not strong enough, you don't progress out of quadruped. Here's the thing. Every single one of us was stronger because we got out of prone. We advanced into quadruped. Why I highlight this? You have to have enough strength to take the next step. If you don't, there is no quadruped. Now, the nice thing is, when you're a baby and mom and dad lay you in supine, mom and dad lay you on prone, you don't got a lot of stuff to do. Hands too small to manipulate the iPhone. They probably haven't done the facial scan for you, so you can't even unlock your iPhone. You can't control the remote control and get on YouTube TV. You got nothing else going on. All you can do is work on strength. So we work on strength. We develop enough strength to get up off the ground. As we get stronger, as we get enough strength, that opens the door to the next thing. Why I say that? In adults, we violate that rule all the time. We do things that we're not strong enough for. And guess what happens? We run into problems. Our body finds workarounds and compensations. Remember, with the sequence, there are no workarounds and compensations. There's a sequence, you start it, you finish it. The only place the road splits is quadruped, sitting, and it comes back together. If you don't have adequate strength, you don't move to the next level. You have no choices. There are no workarounds without appropriate levels of strength. As adults, when we start talking about this, and we'll talk about this, we talk about the continuum side of this. As adults, this is one of the biggest rules we violate. And where we see this violated the most? Running. Go for a run. It's good for your cardiovascular fitness. And it is. And if you're strong enough to run, wonderful. But most people aren't strong enough to run. And we see the plantar fasciitis. We see the IT band issues. We see the anterior knee pain, the tendinopathies. We see all of the issues, all of the chronic issues that runners deal with. If we started strength testing our runners, the information that we would get from that, it's not a hard problem to fix. We work on force, we work on endurance, we give them force and endurance that actually is appropriate to the thing they're trying to do, all of our problems go away. We just never look at strength because we don't appreciate this rule that we have to have appropriate levels of strength to progress to the next level. If we don't, our nervous system finds a workaround, we run into problems. And those problems in our world are pain and issues that we don't know what the answer for is. And we don't know what the answer is because we aren't looking hard enough. Because we've always thought that it's an IT band issue, it's anterior knee pain, it's an inflammatory issue. Well, okay, wonderful, let's say it is. But why is it inflamed? It shouldn't be. There's 300 million other people that go out and run every single day and their IT band's not inflamed. Why is yours inflamed? Not the road that you're running on because 100 other people ran on that route right before you did and their IT band's not inflamed. So it's not because the road curves one way. And you're not the only person that wears that pair of shoes. So why is your IT band inflamed? Let's stop blaming all these extrinsic things and let's first look internally and let's look at strength. Because when we violate this rule of having enough strength to go from one posture to the next, we're going to run into problems. And they're very predictable problems. All right, that's all we're going to talk about. We'll pick up on quadruped on Thursday.